Before we jump into the individual episodes, I think it's important to talk about what makes Tales Beyond the Tomb different from a lot of other horror games on the market. When most people think of horror games, they immediately think about monsters, ghosts, demons, haunted locations, or some supernatural force that's trying to kill the player. Tales Beyond the Tomb takes a different approach. Instead of asking what if the monsters were real, it asks a much more uncomfortable question. What if the real threat was another person? Created by 616 Games, Tales Beyond the Tomb is an episodic horror anthology inspired by real-world mysteries, disappearances, serial killers, and disturbing events that have happened throughout history. Each episode places you in the shoes of a completely different character, facing completely different situations. Sometimes you're investigating a mystery, and sometimes you're just trying to survive a dangerous encounter. Other times you're simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. That I can tell you right now, that happens to me a lot. But despite every episode telling a different story, they all share the same core idea: the fear of the unknown. What immediately grabbed my attention when I started this series was how believable everything felt. The characters aren't superheroes, they're not trained soldiers, and they're not carrying entire arsenals of weapons. They're just ordinary people trying to make it through an extraordinary situation that relatably makes the horror hit much harder. Throughout the series, you'll encounter isolated small towns, abandoned locations, dangerous strangers, serial killers, cult-like groups, and mysteries that seem impossible to explain. And unlike many horror games that rely on constant jump scares, Tales Beyond the Tomb focuses heavily on atmosphere and tension. The games are constantly putting you into situations where your instincts are telling you that something isn't right, or maybe it's a conversation that feels off. Maybe it's a person acting strangely. Maybe it's a location that feels far too quiet, or maybe it's that feeling in the back of your mind that tells you it's time to leave. The series does an incredible job making you question everything around you. One thing I really appreciated while playing through these games was how much each episode managed to create its own unique identity. Pineville Night Stalker focuses on isolation and suspicion. The farm secret leans heavily into mystery and uncertainty. The Last Vigil creates a feeling of helplessness and dread that never lets up. White Silence uses nature itself as a source of terror. And Route 86 turns everything up to 11 with some of the most aggressive and dangerous threats in the entire series. Even though every episode follows a different cast of characters and a different storyline, they all feel connected throughout the same themes: isolation, fear, mystery, human evil, and a terrifying realization that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can encounter isn't a monster hiding in the dark, it's another person standing right in front of you. After finishing every episode, I walked away feeling like Tales Beyond the Tomb is one of the most underrated horror anthologies currently available. It's not the most polished series, it's not the biggest, and it's certainly not perfect. But what it does better than many other horror games is make you feel vulnerable. Situations feel realistic, the threats feel believable, and because of that, the fear feels real. Today we're going to look over at every episode in the series and talk about what worked, what didn't work, discuss my favorite moments, and then rank every game from worst to best, and ultimately answer one question: which Tales Beyond the Tomb episode deserves to be remembered as the best in the franchise? So we're going to start the video off with episode 1, the Pineville Night Stalker. My first impression was I honestly didn't know what to expect. At first, I thought the Tales Beyond the Tomb was probably going to be another attempt to recreate the success of Fears to Fathom. The premise seemed familiar on the surface. A seemingly normal person returned to a quiet town. Something isn't quite right. The game opens with Megan finishing up work and preparing to take leave alongside a coworker who agrees to accompany her back home. Right away, the story establishes something important about Megan. She's not returning home because she wants to. She's turning her home because she has to. After being estranged from her mother for 6 years, Megan receives news that her mother has passed away. The trip back to Pineville isn't a happy reunion or a nostalgic visit. It's a return to a chapter of life that she had already moved on from. That immediately gave the story more emotional weight than I expected. Instead of being dropped into a horror scenario right away, We're given a character who is already carrying emotional baggage before the horror even begins. And honestly, I think that helps make the rest of the game more effective. As Megan and her companion arrive in Pineville, one of the first things I noticed was how quiet everything felt. It wasn't necessarily scary or just quiet. The neighborhood felt like it was like frozen in time. The streets were empty, the night sky is beautiful and calm, the atmosphere is calm, and for a while, it almost feels like you're simply revisiting your hometown. Some of my favorite moments in the entire episode actually happen before anything truly scary occurs. We go from sitting on the porch looking into the night sky at the beautiful stars to ordering pizza and exploring the house while we engage with our companion a few times. These moments give you time to settle in and become comfortable with your surroundings, and that's exactly why the horror works. The game spends enough time making the house feel safe before it begins taking that safety away from you. The biggest strength of Pineville Night Stalker is its atmosphere. The game does an incredibly good job at making ordinary situations feel increasingly uncomfortable. Nothing feels immediately threatening. Instead, the tension builds slowly. The more people you meet, the more suspicious everyone becomes. Jacob immediately stood out to me. At first, he just seemed like an old man neighbor who came to check in, but every interaction leaves you with more questions than answers. Then you have the pizza delivery guy, then the mysterious visitor who shows up in the middle of the night. The game constantly introduces characters that are openly hostile, but never fully trustworthy. And because of that, I find myself questioning every interaction. Every conversation felt like it could suddenly become dangerous. That's something the game does really well. It doesn't tell you who the threat is, it forces you to figure it out. Another thing that really worked for me was how the game isolates Megan. At first, you're not alone. You have your friend with you. And then you feel relatively safe because, you got another person in the home with you. Then suddenly, the dynamic changes. He has to go out to collect paperwork for your job. So now it's just you. And that's when things start happening. The game understands a simple principle. People feel safer in groups. So the moment that you were made to be alone, every strange noise becomes more noticeable. Every shadow becomes more suspicious. Every knock at the door feels threatening. The isolation creates tension without needing jump scares. And Pineville Night Stalker uses that extremely effectively. My favorite sequence in the entire episode has to be the power box incident. Up until that point, there's still a part of you that wants to believe everything is a misunderstanding. Maybe you're overthinking things. Maybe you're just paranoid. Then somebody intentionally damages the power box outside your home. Suddenly all the suspicion becomes real. What follows is one of the most intense moments in the game. You're forced to run back toward the house while someone is actively pursuing you. The panic immediately kicks in. The focus shifts from solving a mystery to simply surviving. When I finally got back inside the house and locked the door behind me, I felt genuine relief. That moment transformed the entire experience for me. The threat was no longer theoretical. It was standing outside my door. Another memorable moment was when Jacob entered the house claiming he was searching for someone he believed had been snooping around. The scene itself isn't particularly violent, but it creates an incredible amount of tension. You don't know if he's telling the truth, you don't know if he's trying to help, and you don't know if you're standing face to face with the very person you've been afraid of all night. These moments of uncertainty are where Pineville Night Stalker shines. While I enjoyed the episode overall, it wasn't perfect. The biggest issue I had was the pacing. There were several moments where I felt like the story progression happened a little too abruptly. Sometimes I'll move to a specific area, trigger an event, and then immediately the screen would go black and it would push me into the next story segment without much build up. It occasionally felt like the game was rushing to get me to the next major plot point. There was also moments that became somewhat predictable. Once my companion left, I knew almost immediately that things were about to go wrong. The game spends so much time establishing safety that the moment you're left alone, it's obvious that danger is coming. That doesn't ruin the experience, but it does remove some of the surprise. The Pineville Night Stalker had the difficult task of introducing the Tales Beyond the Tomb series, and while it may not be the strongest entry in the franchise, it successfully established many of the elements that would define future episodes. The atmosphere is excellent, the tension is effective, the mystery keeps you engaged, and the small town setting creates an uncomfortable feeling that never completely goes away. For me, Pineville Night Stalker feels like a strong foundation. It's the episode that started everything. Even if later entries would improve on the formula, this game deserves credit for introducing the themes of isolation, uncertainty, and the human danger that would eventually become the identity of Tales Beyond the Tomb. Overall, Pineville Night Stalker is a solid introduction to the series, an episode that I still enjoy from the beginning to the end, even if other entries would eventually surpass it. After finishing Pineville Night Stalker, I thought I had a pretty good idea of what Tales Beyond the Tomb was going to be. A realistic horror anthology, suspicious people, small town mysteries, and a slow burn that eventually leads to danger. Then I started The Family Secret, and very quickly, I realized this wasn't just going to be another variation of the same formula. This episode immediately grabbed my attention because of how strange everything felt. The game opens with what appears to be a normal evening. Samantha is preparing dinner and going through what seems like an ordinary routine. At first glance, everything appears normal, but the longer you spend inside the house, the more obvious it becomes that something isn't right. There are strange rules, restricted areas, locked doors, and an uneasy atmosphere hanging over everything. You can feel the game quietly telling you that there's more going on than you're being told. And unlike Pineville Night Stalker, where the danger slowly approaches from the outside, The Farm Secret makes you question the environment you're already trapped inside. One of the things I really liked about this episode is how it slowly reveals the truth about Samantha's situation. Initially, you're led to believe Chris is simply her father. Maybe he's strict, maybe he's overprotective, but nothing immediately screams danger. Then, the game starts pulling back the curtain. Through flashbacks and discoveries, you learn that Samantha isn't living with her father at all. She's been kidnapped. The man she has been living with is her captor, and suddenly everything you've seen up to that point takes on an entirely different meaning. The locked basement, the isolation, the rules, the constant supervision. Everything starts making sense, and that's one of the strongest moments in the entire series because it completely changes your perspective. The game isn't just telling you a story, it's forcing you to reevaluate everything you've already experienced. The greatest strength of The Farm Secret is mystery. More than any other episode of the series, this game constantly keeps you guessing. Every answer raises another question, every clue creates another mystery, and every discovery makes you wonder how deep the situation really goes. I never felt like I fully understood what was happening, and honestly, that's what kept me invested. The game understands that uncertainty can be more frightening than any jump scare. You don't know who Chris really is, you don't know what he's thinking, you don't know what he's hiding. And you don't know what happened before Samantha arrived. And because of that, every interaction becomes uncomfortable. The game keeps feeding you just enough information to keep you moving forward without ever giving you the full picture. That balance is incredibly difficult to achieve, yet The Farm Secret manages to pull it off throughout most of the experience. Another area where the game excels is its atmosphere. Unlike Pineville Night Stalker, which uses an entire neighborhood to create tension, Farm Secrets create horror through confinement. You're not worried about what's outside, you're worried about what's happening inside. The farm feels isolated from the rest of the world. There's nowhere to run, no neighbors, no nearby help, no easy escape. Most of the doors are locked, the basement remains inaccessible, and every room feels like it's hiding something. The longer you spend exploring the house, the more uncomfortable it becomes. Even when nothing is actively happening, there's a constant feeling that something is wrong. It's the type of environment that keeps you on edge, even during the quiet moments. And sometimes those quiet moments are more effective than the scares themselves. For me, the moment that completely changed the game was the first murder. Up to that point, I was still trying to figure Chris out. Part of me wondered if he was simply misunderstood. Maybe he was trying to protect Samantha. Maybe there was another explanation. Maybe I wasn't seeing the whole picture. Then the roadside murder happens, and every possible excuse disappears. The scene instantly confirms that Chris isn't some misunderstood protector. He's dangerous. And from that moment forward, the tension skyrockets. Now you're no longer trying to solve a mystery, you're trying to survive someone you know is capable of murder. That single moment completely changes the tone of the entire episode. The most stressful part of the game for me was having to play dead. It's one of those situations where you already know what happens if you fail. There isn't some complicated monster encounter. There isn't a supernatural threat, simply a human being who will kill you if you realize you're still alive. That realism makes the situation feel incredibly tense. The entire sequence had me on edge because I knew there was no room for mistakes. Moments like that are where the farm secret shines the brightest. The game understands how to create tension without relying on excessive jump scares. Sometimes all it needs is the possibility of being discovered. One thing I appreciated about the farm secret was how it handled its reveal. As the story reaches its conclusion, the game begins connecting all the pieces together. The photographs, the videos, the evidence, the truth behind Chris. Everything finally starts making sense. The final reveal felt satisfying because it answered enough questions while still leaving room for the player to reflect on everything that happened. Rather than relying on a shocking twist ending, the game rewards players who paid attention to the clues throughout the story, and I think that approach worked incredibly well. Despite how much I enjoyed this episode, there were a few weaker sections. The cooking sequence near the beginning felt a little slow. While it helps establish Samantha's routine and daily life, it does drag the pacing down slightly before the mystery really starts moving. The driving sections also felt somewhat stretched out. They aren't terrible, but they don't carry the same tension as the stronger story moments. There were also a few details that raised questions for me. For example, after spending so much effort keeping Samantha trapped, Chris suddenly decorates areas with fragile objects that are surprisingly easily to destroy. It's a small complaint, but certain gameplay moments occasionally felt designed more for player convenience than realism. The Farm Secret was the episode that convinced me Tales Beyond the Tomb was capable of more than simple horror stories. This wasn't just about surviving the killer. It was about uncovering a mystery piece by piece. It was about constantly questioning what was true, and it was about realizing that the person you fear the most may already be standing right beside you. The combination of mystery, suspense, atmosphere, and storytelling make this one of the strongest entries in the entire franchise. While it doesn't quite take my number one spot, it's incredibly close. Farm Secret takes everything Pineville Night Stalker introduced and improves upon it in almost every way. And that's exactly why it lands at number 2 in my ranking. By the time I reached the Last Vigil, I thought I had a pretty good understanding what Tales Beyond the Tomb was trying to accomplish. Pineville Night Stalker focused on suspicion, The Farm Secret focused on mystery. Both games were effective in their own ways, but neither one fully prepared me for what the Last Vigil was about to do. This was the first episode where I felt genuinely uncomfortable from the beginning to the end. Not because of jump scares, not because of the monsters, but because of how believable the entire situation felt. From the opening moment, there's a sense that something is wrong. You can't quite explain it. Nothing immediately dangerous is happening, but the game constantly puts you in a situation that makes you question whether you should even be there in the first place, and a feeling that never goes away. If anything, it only gets worse as the story progresses. The story follows a man who desperately needs money and agrees to take a job working the night shift at the cemetery. A friend helped him get the position as a favor, and at first glance, it sounds like a pretty simple setup. Watch the cemetery, earn some money, make it through the night. Unfortunately, things quickly spiral out of control. The cemetery itself immediately creates an unsettling atmosphere. It's dark, it's isolated, it's the kind of place that already makes people uncomfortable before anything scary even happens. The game takes that discomfort and slowly turns it into dread. The longer you're there, the more you begin to realize that the dead aren't the things you should be worried about, the living are. If I had to describe The Last Vigil using a single word, it would be oppressive. Everything about the environment feels heavy. The darkness feels thicker, the silence feels louder, the isolation feels more complete. Even during moments when nothing is happening, I never felt comfortable. The cemetery is one of the best settings in the entire series because it naturally creates tension without needing anything supernatural. Every shadow looks suspicious. Every sound grabs your attention. Every distant figure makes you wonder if you're alone, or if you've been watched this entire time. The game constantly keeps you second guessing yourself, and because of that, your guard never comes down. One of the biggest reasons this episode stood out to me was because of how helpless I felt. In many horror games, you're given some type of advantage, a weapon, a tool, a safe place, some way to fight back. The Last Vigil doesn't really give you that luxury. You're just a guy trying to make it through the night. You don't have special skills, you don't have combat training, you don't have a plan. And because of that, every threat feels more dangerous. The game constantly reminds you that you're in a situation that is bigger than you. No matter what choices you make, it feels like you're slowly walking towards something terrible. And that's exactly what makes the tension so effective. The villains in The Last Vigil are easily my favorite antagonists in the entire franchise. Unlike previous episodes where the threat often revolves around a single individual, this episode introduces an entire group. 2 women, 3 men. 5 people who immediately make every interaction feel uncomfortable. And what makes them so effective isn't that they're constantly threatening you, it's the opposite. They're friendly, they're welcoming, they're inviting. And somehow, that makes them even more dangerous. Because deep down, you know something isn't right. The game does an incredible job creating uncertainty around their intentions. Every conversation feels loaded with hidden meaning. Every invitation feels suspicious. Every encounter leaves you questioning whether you're looking at future victims or future killers. The answer becomes clearer as the story progresses, and it's not good. Without question, my favorite scene in the entire episode involves the women who repeatedly try to convince you to spend time with them. Now looking back on it, every warning sign imaginable was there. The situation was suspicious, the timing was suspicious, the people were suspicious, and everything about it screamed danger. And honestly, if I was actually in that situation in real life, I probably would have been the first person to get captured. No cap. It's one of those moments where the game puts the player in a situation that feels believable enough to make you question your own judgment. You know something is wrong, but at the same time, you're curious, and your curiosity is exactly what gets people into trouble. That scene perfectly captures what makes The Last Vigil so effective. It doesn't rely on fear, it relies on bad decisions waiting to happen. The Last Vigil contains some of the best tension building in the entire series. Instead of throwing constant scares at the player, the game slowly increases pressure over time. Every interaction adds another layer of discomfort. Every encounter raises more questions. Every strange event feels connected to something bigger happening behind the scenes. The story keeps tightening the screws, and eventually the pressure becomes unbearable. Best horror isn't when something jumps out at you. The best horror is when you know something bad is coming but you don't know when. The Last Vigil understands that concept perfectly. For most of the game, you're simply waiting for the inevitable, and when it finally arrives, it hits hard. If I had to choose the most intense moment in the entire episode, it would easily be the car escape scene. By this point, all the tension that has been building throughout the story finally explodes. The danger isn't hidden, the threat is no longer implied, everything is out in the open. Now survival becomes the only thing that matters. The quick time event forces you to try to stay engaged, the pacing suddenly accelerates, and every mistake feels like it could be your last. It's one of the few moments in the series where I genuinely felt my heart rate increase. Not because I was scared, but because I was invested. I wanted to survive. I wanted to escape. And the game did an incredible job making me feel that urgency. When I look back at the entire Tales Beyond the Tomb series, The Last Vigil is the episode that stayed with me the longest. It combines everything the franchise does well into one package. The mystery from the farm secret, the atmosphere from White Silence, the danger from Route 86, and the realism from Pineville Stalker. Everything comes together here. The story is engaging, the villains are memorable, the tension never lets up, and the feeling of helplessness remains present from beginning to end. Most importantly, it feels believable. Nothing about the situation feels impossible, and nothing feels exaggerated. The entire experience feels like something that could happen to an unlucky person who made a few wrong decisions at the wrong time. That's exactly why it worked so well for me. The Last Vigil represents everything I love about Tales Beyond the Tomb. It's tense without relying on cheap jump scares, it's disturbing without becoming ridiculous, and it's memorable long after the credits roll. Every episode in the series has something about it, but The Last Vigil is the one that put everything together the best. For me, this wasn't just the strongest episode in the franchise. It was the episode that proved Tales Beyond the Tomb could stand alongside some of the best indie horror experiences available today. And that's why The Last Vigil earns my number 1 spot. After finishing The Last Vigil, my expectations for White Silence were incredibly high. At this point, Tales Beyond the Tomb had been getting better and better with each episode for me. Pineville Night Stalker introduced the formula. Farm Secret improved the storytelling. The Last Vigil delivered what I consider the best overall experience in the franchise. Then White Silence arrived. And honestly, this was probably the episode I was most excited to play. The premise alone immediately grabbed my attention. Unlike the previous games that focused primarily on killers, kidnappers, and suspicious strangers, White Silence takes inspiration from one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in history, the Dyatlov Pass incident. For those unfamiliar with it, 9 experienced hikers mysteriously died under extremely strange circumstances in the Ural Mountains of Russia back in 1959. To this day, nobody knows exactly what happened. There are dozens of theories, avalanches, military experiments, paranormal activity, government cover-ups, alien encounters, and everything in between. The fact that nobody has ever found a definite answer is exactly what makes the mystery so fascinating. So naturally, a horror game inspired by that event had my full attention from the start. The story follows an investigator attempting to uncover the truth behind a tragic mountain expedition years after the original incident occurred. Unlike previous entries, where it's surrounded by suspicious people almost immediately, White Silence takes a different approach. For most of the experience, your enemy isn't another person, it's the environment itself. You begin the journey with a guide as you travel deeper into the frozen wilderness. At first, it almost feels peaceful. The snow-covered mountains are beautiful, the scenery is impressive, the environment feels massive compared to previous games in the series. But the farther you travel, the more uncomfortable things become. The weather gets worse, the visibility drops, the winds grow stronger, and eventually the mountain begins to feel less like a location and more like a living thing trying to push you back. If there's one thing White Silence absolutely nails, it's atmosphere. This is easily one of the most immersive environments in the entire series. The snowstorms constantly limit your visibility, the blizzards make navigation difficult, the freezing temperatures create a sense of urgency, and the sound design is incredibly cool. The wind really never lets you relax. The strange noises seem to echo through the mountains. At times it almost sounds like voices are being carried through the storm. Whether those sounds are real or simple, the result of fear and exhaustion doesn't really matter. Because the effect is the same, you're constantly uncomfortable. The game creates a feeling that something is out there, watching, waiting, just beyond the limits of your vision. And because the environment restricts what you can see, your imagination starts filling in the blanks. That's where White Silence is at its strongest. One thing I really appreciated about White Silence was how it tells its story through the environment. Unlike previous episodes that rely heavily on conversations and direct interactions, White Silence often lets the world tell the story for you. As you explore the mountain, you begin finding clues left behind by the missing expedition. Abandoned equipment, makeshift camps, crosses marking locations where explorers lost their lives, scattered remnants of a tragedy frozen in time. Every discovery raises more questions. Every clue makes the mystery feel larger. And every new location reinforces the idea that something terrible happened here. The mountain itself becomes a character, a silent witness to events nobody fully understands. And I think that's one of the most unique aspects of this episode. One thing that separates White Silence from the rest of the series is how much of the horror comes from the nature itself. Most Tales Beyond the Tomb episodes place the danger in another person, a killer, a kidnapper, a cult, a predator. White Silence removes that certainty. Instead, you're forced to deal with freezing temperatures, harsh weather, avalanches, exhaustion, and isolation. There were several moments where I wasn't worried about being murdered. I was worried about simply surviving the mountain. The mechanic requiring you to stop at heated shelters and campfires to avoid freezing adds another layer of tension. You can't just keep moving forward. You have to constantly manage your survival, and that creates a completely different kind of horror than we've seen before. Another aspect I enjoyed was the psychological side of the experience. Throughout the journey, strange sounds, whispers begin appearing throughout the environment. Sometimes it sounds like voices, sometimes it sounds like distant cries, sometimes it sounds like something calling out through the storm. Whether these events are supernatural or simply the result of isolation and mental exhaustion is left open to interpretation. And I actually think that's the correct decision. The uncertainty makes everything more effective. The less the game explains, the more your imagination takes over. And horror is often strongest when your mind starts creating possibilities that are scarier than any answer the game could provide. Now, despite everything I've said so far, White Silence still ended up at the bottom of my ranking. And honestly, that's less about what White Silence did wrong and more about how strong the other episodes were. The biggest issue for me was the story. The atmosphere, the environment, and the mystery was incredible, but I never became so emotionally invested in the character as I did in The Farm's Secret or The Last Vigil. I felt connected to the mystery. I didn't necessarily feel connected to the people. The exploration also felt a little more linear than I expected. For a game centered around investigating a massive mountain range, I was hoping for slightly more freedom in how discoveries were made. Instead, much of the experience follows a fairly straightforward path. Again, that's not necessarily bad, of course, but it did make some sections feel less engaging compared to the more character-driven episodes. Even though White Silence ranks last on my list, I want to be very clear about something. Being number 5 does not mean it's a bad game. Not even close. In fact, White Silence probably has the strongest atmosphere in the entire franchise. The reason it falls lower for me is because I personally connected more with the stories, mysteries, and characters found in the other episodes. White Silence excels at making you feel small, insignificant, alone, and vulnerable against forces you don't fully understand. For many players, that may be exactly why it's their favorite entry, and honestly, I completely understand that perspective. White Silence is one of the most unique stories in Tales Beyond the Tomb. Instead of focusing on killers and humans, it turns the environment itself into the source of fear. The snowstorms, the freezing temperatures, the isolation, the unanswered questions. Everything works together to create an experience that feels haunting long after it's over. While it ultimately lands at number 5 in my ranking, that's more a reflection of how much I enjoyed the other entries than a criticism of White Silence. If you're looking for the most atmospheric game in the series, White Silence is probably the answer. And even though it's my lowest ranked episode, it's still an experience I would absolutely recommend to horror fans. After finishing White Silence, I wasn't entirely sure what to expect from Route 86. White Silence had focused heavily on atmosphere isolation and environmental storytelling. It was a slower experience that relied on mystery and the fear of the unknown. Route 86 immediately feels different. The opening introduces us to a group of friends headed out on what should be a fun road trip. Nothing about the setup screams horror. In fact, it feels like the beginning of a summer vacation movie. You have two couples, Zach and Jessica, Travis and Crystal, along with Kenny, who quickly becomes the odd man out of the group. Their plan is simple: hit the road, enjoy the trip, make it to the beach, have a good time. Unfortunately, horror games don't exactly reward good plans. After learning about an incident ahead on the highway, the group is forced to find an alternate route, a seemingly harmless detour. One decision, one wrong turn, and from that point forward, everything begins falling apart. One thing I immediately appreciated about Route 86 was how natural the group dynamic felt. For the first time in the series, we're not spending most of the game alone. We're surrounded by multiple characters who interact with one another regularly. The conversation feels believable, the friendships feel believable, and because of that, I actually started caring about what happened to them. That might not sound important, but it makes a huge difference once things start going wrong. In previous entries, the focus was usually on a single protagonist surviving a dangerous situation. Route 86 raises the stakes by giving you multiple people to worry about. The danger isn't just happening to you anymore, it's happening to everyone, and that creates a different kind of tension. One thing that immediately separates Route 86 from the rest of the franchise is how it quickly reveals its threat. Most Tales Beyond the Tomb games thrive on uncertainty. You're constantly asking questions. Who can I trust? What's really happening? Who's behind all this? Route 86 doesn't spend nearly as much time hiding the danger. Once the pig mask killer enters the picture, there's very little ambiguity. This person wants you dead. And unlike previous episodes where you could occasionally convince yourself things might work out, Route 86 removes that comfort almost immediately. The threat is obvious, the danger is real, and survival becomes the primary objective. That change in direction gives 86 a much faster pace than my previous entry. The Pig Mask Killer is easily one of the most memorable antagonists in the entire franchise. Not because he's mysterious, complex, but he's relentless. The moment he appears, every encounter becomes dangerous. Every location becomes a potential trap. Every open field suddenly feels unsafe. What makes him particularly effective is that there isn't much room for doubt. In Pineville Night Stalker, you're questioning people. The Farm Secret, you're uncovering secrets. The Last Vigil, you're trying to figure out who the real threat is. And in Route 86, all that uncertainty is gone. The killer's intentions are crystal clear, and somehow that simplicity works. The gas station attendant and his brother create an immediate sense of danger because they aren't hiding behind friendly faces. They're predators, and they know exactly what they're doing. That direct approach makes Route 86 feel far more aggressive than the previous entries. One of the smartest decisions Route 86 makes is also allowing players to experience the story through multiple characters. This adds a layer of unpredictability that previous episodes didn't have. Every time the perspective changes, you're forced to adapt to a new situation. You don't know who's safe, you don't know who's going to survive, and you don't know who might be next. That uncertainty kept me invested throughout the entire experience. Instead of focusing on one person's survival, Route 86 constantly reminds you that the entire group is in danger, and because you spend time with each character, every loss carries more weight. The moment that really changed the tone for me was Zach's death. Up until that point, there was still a small part of me hoping everyone might make it out alive. Then Route 86 delivers its first major shock. Suddenly, the game establishes that nobody is protected, nobody has plot armor, and nobody is guaranteed to survive. And once that realization hits, every encounter becomes more intense, because now you know the game is willing to pull the trigger, literally and figuratively. From that moment forward, every character felt vulnerable, and that uncertainty elevated the entire experience. If I had to choose the most intense sequence in Route 86, it would easily be the cornfield chase. This moment perfectly captures what makes the episode so effective. Visibility is limited, the environment feels claustrophobic. Despite being outdoors and you know the pigmask killer is somewhere nearby, the entire sequence had me constantly looking over my shoulder. Every turn felt dangerous, and every wrong decision felt like it could be my last. What makes the scene work so well is that it strips away any sense of control. You're not solving a puzzle, you're not investigating clues, you're running for your life, and sometimes that's all a horror game needs. One of the most surprising moments in the entire game comes at the ending. Not spoiling too much for anyone, so spoilers ahead who hasn't played it. Jessica's transformation during the final moments caught me completely off guard. It's one of those endings that stick with you because it changes how you view everything that came before it. Throughout the game, you're focused on survival. Then the ending arrives, and suddenly you're forced to reconsider the consequences of everything that happened. It was shocking, unexpected, and honestly, one of the most memorable things in the entire franchise. As much as I enjoyed Route 86, I do think it occasionally leans too heavy into action. Part of what made earlier episodes so effective was the mystery, the uncertainty, the slow build towards danger. Route 86 sometimes trades that tension for more direct confrontation. That's not necessarily bad, of course. In fact, many players will probably prefer the faster pace, but for me, some of the psychological horror that made the Farm Secret and the Last Vigil so memorable gets pushed into the background. There were also a few sections where the pacing moved so quickly that I didn't always have time to absorb what had happened before the next major event occurred. Again, not a huge criticism, but it's one of the reasons Route 86 ultimately falls short of my top 2 spots. Route 86 feels like a culmination of everything the series had learned up to this point. The larger cast, the multiple perspectives, the aggressive villains, the higher body count, the bigger environment. Everything feels bigger. Everything feels more dangerous. Everything feels more intense. The reason it lands at number 3 isn't because it does anything poorly. It's because I personally connected more with the mystery and suspense found in the Farm Secret and the Last Vigil. Those episodes kept me thinking. Route 86 kept me running. Both approaches worked. I just found myself more invested in the psychological side of the horror than the action side. Route 86 is easily the most adrenaline-fueled entry in the Tales Beyond the Tomb series. It's fast, it's intense, it's unpredictable, and it features some of the most memorable villains and chase sequences in the franchise. While it may not have the mystery of the farm secret or the tension of the Last Vigil, it delivers something equally valuable: pure survival horror. For players looking for the most action-packed experience in the series, Route 86 is probably the first game I'd recommend. And while it lands at the number 3 in my ranking, it's still an excellent entry that proves just how much the franchise has evolved since Pineville Night Stalker. After playing through every episode of Tales Beyond the Tomb, I can honestly say this series surprised me. Going into Pineville Night Stalker, I expected another indie horror game trying to capitalize on the success of other anthology series. What I ended up finding was a collection of stories that each brought something unique to the table. Whether it was a small town paranoia of Pineville Night Stalker, the mystery and suspense of the farm secret, the relentless survival horror of Route 86, the frozen isolation of White Silence, or the overwhelming tension of the Last Vigil, every episode managed to leave some kind of impression. And that's honestly one of the biggest strengths of this franchise. No two episodes feel exactly the same. Each one explores fear from a different angle, something that fear comes from isolation, sometimes uncertainty. Sometimes it comes from being trapped in a situation that's completely out of your control. But no matter the setting, the one thing that remains consistent throughout the series is how grounded everything feels. These aren't stories about saving the world. These aren't stories about fighting monsters. These are stories about ordinary people finding themselves in extraordinary situations and desperately trying to survive. And that's what makes them so effective. Because at the end of the day, the scariest part is the killer. It isn't the mystery or the environment. It's the realization that situations like these don't feel impossible. They feel plausible. And that's a lot scarier. So after finishing every episode, here's my final ranking. At number 5, White Silence. Number 4, Pineville Night Stalker. Number 3, Route 86. And number 2, The Farm Secret. And taking the number 1 spot was The Last Vigil. For me, The Last Vigil represents everything that makes Tales Beyond the Tomb great. The atmosphere, the tension, the uncertainty, the feeling that something terrible is waiting just around the corner. It combines every strength the series had developed up to that point and delivers the most memorable experience in the franchise. That being said, this is just my ranking. And honestly, I expect a lot of people to disagree with me. Some of you probably have White Silence as number 1. Some of you might have Route 86. That deserves a top spot. I'm sure there's somebody out there wondering how Pineville Night Stalker isn't higher on the list. So let me know down in the comments, what's your ranking of every Tales Beyond the Tomb episode? Which one scared you the most? Which one had the best story? And which one do you think is the strongest overall entry in the series? If you enjoyed this retrospective, make sure to leave a like and subscribe because we've got plenty more horror content coming to the channel. If there's another horror series you'd like to see me cover in the future, retrospective, let me know. Thank you all for watching. I appreciate every single one of you that made it all the way to the end of this video. As always, I love you guys, and I'll see y'all later.
They are shot,
Peace.
beating down the track.